Good morning.
Morning, Doc.
How are you?
My life is beautiful. La viva
That-
buena.
It's your kind of weather today here in Missouri.
Meaning?
It is muggy and warm. I thought about you this morning as I looked out and I'm like, oh, this is his weather. This is his weather. So, uh, it's we are proof that two different people can be great friends.
It's a great thing. Harry Emerson Fosdick, remember him?
Mhm.
Great preacher. Uh, wrote the great hymn for the living of these days in his biography. He talked about that he was a staunch liberal. I don't know if you were in higher liberals. I don't know anything about that, but his best friend was a conservative Presbyterian, and his famous line was, "Save for opinion, we're the greatest of friends."
There you go.
Love that line.
That is a good line. But yeah, I think I I would prefer it to be crisp and sweater weather all the time.
And I like hot and muggy because I'm a tennis player, and it makes my bones lighten up and loosen up.
There you go. Let you move. Well, so I thought about that this morning. I was also thinking about just the power of balance and moderation, um, and our constant quest for that. That we talk about it in behavioral health sometimes is the concept of psychic equilibrium, trying to move things back to a balance or of sometimes conflicting points of tension. Um, Mindfulness talks about it in the terms of being wise minded or thinking dialectically and that being a healthy place. Um, and a lot of times our search for balance is a bunch of start, stop, start, stops. It's kind of this struggle of, you know, adding a little bit too much of this and trying to balance it with that. And so balance is a real uh, experience as we're constantly trying to moderate and take all the things we want to have in our lives and let them all have the good that they can have. So I've been thinking a lot about that balance, primarily because I got back on the treadmill today, and I've been off for a couple of months. We went on vacation, and I just got out of the habit. I'm like, I got to get back into the habit, and I got back on this morning, on and running. So that's good. Uh, but balance and finding that balance in our field. Wow, we work in a field that can be pretty trendy, can't we?
We do.
I was thinking, what are some, and I thought I'd ask you, what are some of the trends that you've seen in behavioral health, over the last several decades? I just thought it'd be fun to remember a couple of them. Um, I remember one, holding therapy. Uh, it was all about, your touch needs being met, and you have to have your touch needs met, and there's a certain amount of them. So they were developing all these types of therapeutic interventions, and that was integrating a massive amount of holding. And that kind of slid into rebirthing. Do you remember rebirthing?
Of course I do. Sure.
Wrap them up in
Yeah,
tight clothes
100%.
and like reenact this role
Yeah.
play of the birthing process. And so there's one, all that and how trendy that was. Um, what do you remember some of those? What comes to your mind when you think about
Well, the
that?
one that pops into my mind is just this dependence on 12-step groups. And I used to run 12-step groups. I don't know if you did. We've never had that conversation, but just how that has evolved into this mindfulness movement and the sobriety movement, and how much more comfortable I am. I said that in an awkward way, but I have a great deal more comfort and a great deal more appreciation, Doc, for the current way it is, because it's the way I see it. He said with humility and grace. Okay, so that's the one that pops in my mind. I guess it's the one I was kind of the most involved with back in the day, and to see this level of, real kinetic energy, Doc, that has moved towards the sober living, the sobriety life. And you and I, one day I suppose we'll do, I'm tingling because, I've done a lot of work on that because I love the sober life. And so that's the one that pops into my head just off the top of my head.
Yeah, everything at one point. I worked with a psychiatrist at one point, and he came into my office, he just popped in, and he's like, I'm so frustrated with everybody being diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
So there was this period of time where everybody had bipolar disorder. And sometimes those were like literal diagnoses. So it was not just the, Aunt Sally who says you're bipolar, and someone walking in and saying, well, I have bipolar. Well, why do you think you're bipolar? Well, my aunt told me that I was bipolar. These are actually clinicians that are over-diagnosing because it's on their radar. Okay? It's been elevated. And so that, I think, is a trend. I think we've seen trends with different types of therapies that have come up, and approaches. A lot of times it's because it's new, or it's hidden. Some famous person has popularized it in the media. We have one currently going on. Our current trend right now is trauma-informed care. Everything has to be trauma-informed care, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed care. And it's being elevated and talked about and assumed about. And unfortunately, here's the good thing about that in my mind. The good thing is that science is always changing. We're always adding to our information base. Okay? We are discovering new things. I think, for example, remember when the adverse childhood effects studies came out, and they drew this correlation between things that would happen in childhood, and it would have all these medical correlation with all these medical issues in the 40s and 50s year old age brackets. And so suddenly we're like, wait a minute, all these things that we said, oh, they don't really matter, they matter. And so sometimes we do have some like really new information. I think EMDR is a good example. Polyvagal theory. There's a lot of things that are happening in neuropsychology that are new things, and we're looking for ways to integrate those new things. We have to. We're also perfecting past theories and past strategies for treatment. I think that's a good thing. So I don't want to speak in a way that I'm ever interpreted as being saying I don't want us to be looking at the new things and looking at trends of awareness. But I think sometimes the trends get out of hand and we forget some very important things along the way. The fascination with being trauma informed, I don't know is necessarily benefiting the quality or the efficacy of our treatment. I hear a lot of rhetoric, I read a lot of articles, but I'm looking for outcomes. And what I see being missed, for example, is good old-fashioned, if I could say it that way, old-fashioned, proven developmental psychology. Everything isn't reduced to trauma at the expense of getting rid of or forgetting development. And so I see this a lot because I work with children and adolescents, and many of them have a traumatic background. Or when I work with substance abuse clients, almost always you'll find some measure of trauma, not every time, but very often in someone with a substance use disorder. But it's like we have forgotten, wait a minute, these adolescents and these children have to focus on the developmental stage that they're in. And the loss of that awareness takes us out of balance. And development and developmental stages is a key thing. It's one of our top 7, isn't it?
It is, Doc. And, as I listen to you, I think about, my idea of gap theory. And gap theory is basically the idea that the mental health issue, if you want to just call it that, the mental health presenting problem is really a learning gap in that person's life. And as we get into these topics, or this discussion of this topic of development, and really the idea of recasting, and if you will, reforming and reframing how a person views their life, I think it's important for all to remember that we're not the same people that we were at one point in our life, Doc. And I think it's important. I never would, pound sand on anyone that made a diagnosis of someone at a particular moment. But to me, a diagnosis can be, I'm not saying it always is, Doc, but it can be a snapshot. It can be a singular frame or a momentary, series of seasons in a person's life. But that person can grow in and through and because of those things. I have done that in my own life, and I still do that in my own life. And so I would just say to all of us to remember that the things that have harmed us can become the greatest benefactors in our life. I'm going to say that again because it is absolutely true. It is the premise of one of my greatest ideas I've ever had, Doc, which is the only trademark I've ever received from the U.S. government, which is Genius Path. The whole idea that we're going to be forming today, Doc, is the idea that pain and suffering, trauma and turmoil, the crucible of difficulty and real conflict in a person's life, soul conflict, that these things are in essence the very ingredients that produce the best outcomes of our life. And so wherever we all find ourselves, to just always remember that inside of that moment of difficulty are the grains, the seeds of real discovery, and then real personal enterprise and personal gain. And I want us to keep that. That's always my frame, as you know, Doc, as I go about my life and the work that we do. And I always want to hammer the nail in our conversations. You and I are practitioners. We do not discount or disparage anyone that is a theorist, okay? I'm a theorist. But you and I are practitioners. We work in the milieu, that is your word, Doc, of human beings that are troubled, okay? And so the piece that I always wish to bring forth into every session that I practice is to remind myself first, but then the client, that in fact, these things they are staring down, regardless of how they have been interpreted or framed in the past, that they are indeed the essential elements that they're going to use and require to be able to get to the person that they're supposed to be. I want us to think about that as we press forward, Doc. How do you receive that?
I think that's the key. That may be what I'm kind of intuitively feeling about the profession, and its kind of fascination or trendiness with trauma-informed care, is that what you just said needs to be elevated, that trauma is bad, but trauma are the seeds of good.
Yeah.
Hardship, and we're not locked into that. It grieves me to see people find out they have a diagnosis and feel like that diagnosis can never be resolved. They treat they treat mental health diagnoses as if they are static and they will always be there. They're chronic. They're never going to go away. And this is just who I am. And mental health diagnoses are predominantly a collection of symptomology. Okay. And we use a diagnosis to say, here's the symptomology that we're looking at. But all of it has the capacity to change. And that's an exaggeration. Often people do not understand that it is a snapshot in time. And your prognosis is good. You could overcome this. It may take work, but
and I think there's the genius of our work, Doc, and I mean this. And this is really one of the compelling factors of why we do what we're doing here. Is he is a clinician. I am a practitioner, and the two of us together bring this kind of swarm of experience and intelligence and knowledge and learning. And in the middle of it, Doc, arrive these great conversations that I think are compelling. I really do. And so I love what you just said, because it is, in fact, one of the bases of how I operate. Many times in session, Doc, I have said over the years, and will say going forward, just because they said you were does not mean that you cannot. I have used that phrase a million times, I'll bet you, over the last so many years. Just because they said you were does not mean that you cannot. And then we start filling in the blanks of what they thought they could not do. And so it comes up to this idea of arrestation, doesn't it? It comes up to this thing of how we then grow a human being ourselves. Let's start with, I'm not immune from these things, Doc. I am. Okay.
We all are in process.
Okay. I'm not immune from any of this. I'm not above, I don't live in some world where where things just function because I ask them to or wish them to. And so we come to this idea of arrestation. Perhaps you have been stopped in the past. Perhaps all of us have been stopped in the past. And stopping is I must say, Doc, this will be an interesting question for you. Of all of the traumas and all of the impacts and after effect that we face, I think the most egregious, and I mean this, as I've studied over my life and I've written about this, Doc, is when a person arrests. They stop. And when they come into my world or ask me into their world and they're stopped, boy, it is way evident, Doc. What do you think about that?
You mean when they have stalled in the growth process? Is that?
I mean when they have, for whatever reason, decided that they cannot move past this thing.
That it's overwhelming. So that the mountain's too big to climb and they're stuck and they give up.
Yeah.
A lack of motivation, a lack of hope. Those are the characteristics you're identifying?
100% yes.
Yeah. I think I would add to that, though, also, they may have that sense of being stalled or stuck or immobilized. That's the word I want to use. Immobilized in their growth, or they're misdirected. They're doing nothing but running from their past and trying to avoid it. I had a recent session where we finally started touching the points in this client's life that were disturbing them and had resulted in their substance use. It had resulted in the dissolution of their family bonds. Um, Lots of very, very terrible things had resulted from these points. We got there, and it was obvious that we got there because suddenly their countenance changed, their tone changed, they became angry at me, um, and they were usually very, very warm and pleasant and easygoing, but they started resisting me. They were mad at me, and I finally was able to just say, okay, well, you're upset. Tell me about that. Let's leave this past thing behind. And they're like, I don't look at my past. Okay. If I look at my past, it will destroy me. It's behind me. I'm only focusing forward. And here's the line. This is what they said. I used to hate the hate of my past to propel me forward. And I thought, wow. So I would say this client was immobilized in one manner, but in another manner was very misdirected. And that, he was uh, pushed. He was pushing forward in his thoughts, but they were really against himself. So they were like sitting in there spinning in this one place, and they were going to sit and spin in that one place. And well, they will until they decide to move beyond that. So I think a lot of people are either immobilized or they're sitting and spinning in their agony, trying to flee from hardship instead of being able to allow it to be the seeds, like you said earlier, the seeds of something wonderful.